So why do you believe, Bernardo, that consciousness is the foundational substance of reality? Like, how do you know that?
It is the primary datum of existence, right? It's what we have before we begin theorizing and speculating and philosophizing. It's what we start from. We start from conscious state. I am an inveterate reductionist. I think we should always reduce the complex to the simple, always that we can. It's always preferred. And I think the ultimate step of reductionism is to reduce everything to the one pre-theoretical given of nature, right? So I think the best account of reality is to reduce, if we can, the spectacular richness, complexity, and variety of nature to one thing, and that thing being consciousness. Not my consciousness, not your consciousness, but consciousness as a type, a kind of existence, to mentation, so to say.
But how do you know? Like, how do you know that consciousness is the foundational element, that we're all connected through consciousness, that it's not that it's not intrinsic or emergent from physical processes?
I don't know precisely what Susan means by intrinsic. It could be a form of panpsychism. I think I'm very confident in saying that it's not emergent, because to say that consciousness is strongly emergent from a non-conscious substrate is to say precisely nothing. It's just a word. You're not giving that word any semantic grounding, any meaning. It's like saying consciousness is the involuntary wiggling of my left big toe. I can say that, but it doesn't mean anything. It's an arbitrary statement. So I'm very confident that emergentism is false, because there is nothing about physical quantities, physical parameters, in terms of which we could deduce the qualities of experience in principle. Panpsychism, I think, is not preferred, and I have a number of reasons for that. And I think idealism is preferred if we can make it work, if we can account for an obviously external, objective world, if we can account for the fact that we can predict the behavior of this external world and do science and construct theories that can be empirically falsified or not. If we can do that under idealism, in other words, by reducing everything to nature's only pre-theoretical given, I think that is preferred. Now, you ask me, how do I know? I know nothing. I know that I'm conscious. That's about it. How can I know anything else? We are monkeys running around a rock for the past 300,000 years at best, which is yesterday, in the time scale of existence. We know nothing other than the cogito, right? I think, therefore I exist. That's about it. Everything else is a kind of inference, but there are good inferences and bad inferences. And even bad inferences cannot be disproven. I cannot disprove the flying spaghetti monster. It may exist in a hyperdimension and it's moving the planets around the sun.
But you don't believe in the flying spaghetti monster because the evidence for it doesn't meet the threshold that we require.
Exactly. So I cannot refute it categorically, but I do not need to entertain it. In exactly the same vein, I think we do not need to entertain physicalism. We do not need to entertain panpsychism, all of which postulate theoretical entities that are not available to immediate empirical acquaintance. So it's from that perspective that I tell you, I don't know that idealism is right, but I think it is the best hypothesis on the table.
But is it a problem that there's not evidence for it? Like what?
There is.
And Susan, I want to move to you, but what is the evidence that you have that is beyond the evidence you have for flying spaghetti monster? Which you don't believe.
If idealism is right, then physical states are secondary. They are appearances. They are what mental states look like upon a measurement. They don't have standalone existence. They only arise upon observation because they are representations of observation. They are cognitive models, appearances. And lo and behold, that's exactly what physics has been showing for the past 50 years. These experiments got a Nobel Prize in 2022. It turns out that unless we entertain one of two theoretical fantasies for which there is absolutely zero empirical evidence, them being superdeterminism or Everettian multiverses. Unless we entertain one of those fantasies, we have to acknowledge that physics has shown us empirically that physical properties can only be said to exist upon a measurement. In other words, physical properties are representational. They are appearances. The thing that is measured is itself not characterizable through physical properties. In other words, it might as well be mental, because that's the only thing we know of that to exist in which we cannot characterize through physical properties. What is the mass in kilograms of an emotion? What is the length in inches of a thought? So physics is pointing to idealism. Neuroscience can be said to be pointing to idealism as well. If you look at integrated information theory, its ontological implications, which are few, but the ones that there are entirely consistent with idealism. The idea that only things that exist to themselves can have causal effects. That's a pretty idealist idea. Also, the discovery that there are non-ordinary states of consciousness that entail much richer and intenser experience and yet less metabolic activity in the brain, such as psychedelics, also seem to line up with certain idealist ideas about personal consciousness being a dissociated process. There's plenty of empirical evidence that we can point to. It's just that people have to be open to it, but instead they prefer to entertain fantasies for which there is zero empirical evidence, like countless new universes popping up every infinitesimal fraction of a second out of nothing. I mean, anyway.
Susan, why the evidence and examples and narrative that Bernardo is telling about why he believes that consciousness is fundamental, why doesn't that resonate with you? What do you think he's missing there? Or what
he's
about
just done an exposition of just about all these complicated things, and I don't know where to begin. I was just wanting to jump in there about 10 times, and now I don't know where to jump.
Take your time. I'll sit back and I will listen.
I'd much rather we could actually have a discussion. But anyway,
okay.
Let's see. I share a lot of your ideas, well, practically all of them really, about the problems of the current views in the consciousness studies. I'm not going to say so much about the physics. I am, unlike you, not so versed in physics and maths and so on. My problems are with the whole idea that consciousness arises from matter. This is intrinsic to the hard problem. The way that Dave Chalmers coined the phrase back in 1994 was trying to understand how subjective experience arises from objective matter, and many other ways of putting it. I think that is a real problem. It leads to the hunt for the neural correlates of consciousness, which seems to imply, most of the ways you read it and most of the experiments done, that people are looking for somewhere in the brain or some process in the brain or some structure in the brain, which is responsible for giving rise to this extra thing called consciousness. And not surprisingly, they never find it. What they find is the neural correlates of this thought or that intention or this movement or whatever, but never consciousness itself. And that phrase to me is always a problem. Consciousness itself, kind of separate from everything else. And it also leads to ideas of which bits will produce consciousness, the idea that consciousness is generated, and it leads to problems with the question about why did we evolve consciousness and zombies and a whole lot of other things. I think where I differ with Bernardo, and he's sort of touched on this, I think you have Bernardo here, is the underlying explanation for order in the universe we see. Because I want to know why. Now, I'm starting from a kind of representationalist point of view. If you're interested, I'll come back to what my own view is here. But to my mind, there has to be something underlying that. And maybe it's some obscure mathematical thing. There are interesting physicists working on ideas of that kind that would give rise to this. But if you say that everything is mental, then there are various ways you can take. And Bernardo, I think, you've taken a way that uses the analogy of alters in split personality situations, which is a very interesting way of going about it. But I'm interested, but I don't follow you there. I stick with the idea that we are ourselves are illusory. Or most of the ideas that consciousness studies seem to bring up about consciousness are wrong. But I can't follow you yet, would you say, into going a full idealist direction?
Why?
Well, for that reason, I do not buy, of all of the things that I have read and heard of what you said, this idea about multiple personality doesn't ring true to me. Why should the world look this way? Why should it split up in that way? It doesn't provide answers. Now, does materialism provide answers? Well, at least ideas about gravity and interactions and so of atomic particles and so on. I'm not of the view that these things exist and we're actually seeing them as they are, but that there is this structure here that seems to make sense of why the physical world behaves the way it does. That seems to me you haven't got in your analytic idealism.
I'll try to explain my view. I'm not trying to convince you of it. I'm trying to just make clear.
To help me explain it, help me understand it, not to convince me, is the way I would think about it. I would like to understand it better. Whether I'm convinced or not, we shall see. Is that fair enough?
Okay, I'll do my best. Let's forget dissociation for the moment. If that's the contentious point, we can set it aside. Do you acknowledge that there is a clear separation between my inner states and the states of the external world, and between your inner states and the states of the external world? Can we acknowledge that this is the case?
Well, I thought you were saying there isn't any external world. I thought you're saying that there's only mental states. So I'm not sure what you're asking me.
Yeah, I even wrote about a previous discussion we had in my latest book. I even name you, and I know that that's the difficulty because I have seen this before. So I'll try to be as explicit as possible. There is an external world. And it is not Bernardo Kastrup. It's not made of the mental contents of Bernardo Kastrup. It's not made of my perceptual qualities. It's not made of the reds I see. It's not made of the flavors I taste. The reds I see, the flavors I taste, these are internal mental states. There are external mental states that I do not have direct acquaintance with, that I can only perceive through the intermediation of sensing, of my sense organs. So under analytic idealism, there is an external world. And it would still be there if I were not here. It would still be there if none of us were here. And it does not change because of our wishes and morning affirmations and fantasies and likes and dislikes. It is what it is, independent and separate of us. But it too is made of mental states. Think of it like my thoughts right now. I'm having thoughts right now. Whether they are reducible or not, I'm having subjective states, mental states right now. I would still be having my thoughts, even if you were not there talking to me right now. Even if you didn't exist, there would still be my thoughts. You cannot access my thoughts directly. You can only observe my appearance to make inferences about what I might be thinking or how I might be feeling. But my thoughts are external to you. And yet my thoughts are subjective. Reducible or not, my thoughts are here. They are subjective. They are external to you. In exactly the same way, an analytic idealist would say, there is an external world. It doesn't depend on us. It would still be there if we were not here. But it is made of mental states. Mental states we cannot access directly. We can only represent those mental states through the screen of perception. So the physical world, what appears on the screen of perception, the things we see, touch, hear, feel, the textures, the flavors, the sounds, the colors, these are cognitive representations of our own, which correlate with the mental states that constitute the external world. But I have no direct access to those mental states. All I have are the representations. So physicality is representational. I am a representationalist like you. But the real world behind the representations, that which is represented through my mental states, are also mental states. Mental states I'm not directly privy to. which I represent in the form of perception. But there is an external world. It just doesn't require that we create a new ontological category next to mental states. Mental states are what's given, right? It's the pre-theoretical given. All I'm saying is that, well, there is an external world, but it's made of the same type, the same ontic category of my inner mental states. It's not made of my inner mental states, but it's of the same type as my inner mental states. And what separates me from the world is a dissociative boundary. But okay, forget about that. Whatever separates me from the external world, there is a separation between my mental states and the external mental states that constitute the world. They are mental, and physicality emerges once we observe those states. They impinge on our sense organs, they impinge on our altar, if you will, and then we cognitively represent them, like an airplane dashboard represents the results of the airplane's measurements done through the airplane's sensors. The physical world is that dashboard representation for me. But the thing which is sensed, the thing which is measured, is really out there. It's just mental. It's not physical, because physicality is the dashboard, and the world is not the dashboard. But it's really there. It's really external. It's real. Does not depend on me and doesn't care about my morning affirmations.
I'm not sure what you have really added there by saying that it's mental. You're trying to get away from the obvious gap between physical material as materialists have it. But you've just said, I'm just going to call it mental. But if it's inaccessible, then I'm not sure how this works. You said you don't want to talk about the dissociative boundaries, so I'll stick with the question of why it has the structure it does, because the way we can introspect and find the way our own thoughts work, you're saying that's all we can have, but we have to hypothesize about the kind of machinery that makes that. I mean, I'm particularly interested in predictive processing and our brains as prediction machines. Why are brains like that? If it's all made of mental, I don't know how it helps at all. So you're saying we're both representationalists. Then I want to ask about, in your view, where do these representations come from? What is the substrate in which that constructs those representations? You're just going to say that's mental, but I'm not sure what you're really adding or why you're explaining anything by calling it mental.
I'm removing unnecessary inferences that lead to problems, such as the hard problem of consciousness. If we unnecessarily postulate that there is a new category of existence, which is not mental, whatever it is, it's not mental. And then we say, and the mental arises from it. Now we have an explanatory gap, and the whole thing goes to hell because it's an impossible situation. So by removing that unnecessary baggage that leads to insoluble problems, we end up in a situation where things make sense. Let me be very explicit about it. My mental states, for whatever reason, are separated from the mental states of the world. I think it's because it's dissociation, and dissociation happened because it could happen, and given enough time, everything that can happen in nature is bound to happen. And guess what? Dissociation happened. We call it life. We call it abiogenesis. That's what it looks like when I represented biology. The states of the world impinge on my inner states. That impingement provides me with information about the world. So evolution has zeroed into amplifying that impingement. And that's our sensory organs. That's perception. Now, is perception a problem under idealism? Not at all. We have mental states on one hand, mental states on the other, and external mental states causally impinge on internal mental states, thereby modulating them. That's causation from mental to mental. And it's trivial. My thoughts impinge on my emotions and modulate my emotions every day. And the other way around. My emotions impinge on my thoughts and modulate my thoughts every day. Negative emotion, negative thought.
Well, what's
external
the boundary
mental
here?
states.
You've implied there a very clear boundary between the internal ones and the external ones.
Yeah.
So what is making that boundary? I think we have to come to this dissociation problem. At least you may not go that way, but you could talk very clearly about an internal things you can access or are accessing, and this external ones which you still call mental. What makes that boundary if it isn't to be that is a body and has these properties and so on?
I think the external surface of the body is what the boundary looks like. It's what the boundary looks like: your skin, your retina, your eardrums, the inner lining of your digestive tract. How did it happen? Why did it happen? I personally, I don't think it's productive to ask whys of nature. I think in nature, things that can happen. And at some point, a dissociative process happened that could reproduce, that could spin out other dissociative processes. And then all the rules of natural selection kick in. And guess what? That's how we emerged, because once there was a dissociation that could spin out other dissociations. And of course, we are descendants of that, and not of the ones that couldn't spin out other dissociations. The whole process kicks in. Now, how did dissociation happen? Because it could happen. I think what we call the physical world is a representation of the real world, which is mental. But that doesn't make our understanding of physics invalid. We understand the world through the physical representation. So the laws of physics still hold. The laws of chemistry still hold. They represent what we could call a dissociation in and of itself. And at one point, it did happen. And here we are. It's just as simple as that. Now, I think we tend, some idealists and people who are dabbling in idealism, they tend to anthropomorphize the external mental states too much. I see the external mental states as states that unfold according to their own inherent dispositions. In psychological language, you could call it archetypes. In other words, they do what they do because they are what they are, and that is pretty much automatic. They have inherent properties that govern the way they interact with one another and how the whole thing evolves along the arrow of time. You could even call it mechanistic. I mean, you're a psychologist. You know the human mind is more mechanistic than most lay people would think. We are more predictable than most lay people would think. I think the external world is not a mind that deliberates, that makes plans or has goals. It unfolds instinctively. Well, it's certainly not the Abrahamic God. I think the Hindu God, Brahman, it comes pretty close because they don't add these extra anthropocentric properties to Brahman. It's just a field of subjectivity. I'm pretty comfortable with that. I mean, I don't need to use the G word, but some people like to, and I try to be friendly to that. But it's not something that it's outside nature, deliberating and has a plan and passes value judgments. No, it's a system, and it has inherent properties, and it does what it does because it is what it is, and it does so very spontaneously. Cause will lead to effect, and if you repeat the cause under the same circumstances, it will lead to the same effect, and it's predictable. And our minds have become less predictable because we evolved under the constraints of a planetary ecosystem with limited resources, and we had to evolve strategies in order to respond to environmental threats and opportunities. So our mind is more reactive. And entails higher level mental functions that were useful for evolution. We can plan, we can deliberate, we can pass value judgments. All this stuff has evolved and made our minds less predictable because of the forces of natural selection. But I don't think these higher level mental functions are inherent in the mental fabric of reality. And that's why physics works. Because, the mental states that constitute the inanimate world are archetypally driven. And therefore, they are predictable. They have inherent dispositions, and you can predict how they will behave given the circumstances around it. And that's why physics works. I don't see a contradiction between that and saying those external states are mental.
I'm still struggling with... You've got away from the hard problem by being a monist of a sort. And I've always described myself, people have called me a materialist, drives me putty, because I've always described myself as a neutral monist. I reject dualism, and I really don't know what this mon is, this one, whatever. So you are, I'm very happy to see having a really strong and powerful attempt to provide a monist view.
Monism.
Yeah. A monism, yeah. But I want to come back to not back to the hard problem, but to what we mean by consciousness. I mean, this is really where we were starting from. And in my view, if we go back to Nagel, if you think about the history of consciousness studies, not going back centuries, not even going back to William James and Helmholtz and such like brilliant people then, but just going back to the 1990s and the start of the mess I believe we've got in. And I think you and I would agree that consciousness studies is in a right mess with loads and loads of theories. I love the attempts to compare one with the other, and then they don't come up with any answer, which doesn't surprise me. But so I want to go back to Nagel, where most people have started from. So they start from the question, what is it like to be a bat? Now, I think what's good about what Nagel said there is to home in on what it is like to be. Because that's, here I am feeling conscious. Oh, gosh, I've been so hard thinking about what we're talking about. I wasn't really me here. Now I've asked the magic question, am I conscious now? And poof, I seem to be here. This is a digression. But going back to what is it like to be, so far so good. But then when you add what is it like to be a bat, you have jumped across from the sense of what it's like to a physical object in a supposed physical world. So you inevitably are stuck with a hard problem. So what I am trying to play with, and the same as you, I don't want to convince you this is right, but I'd love to be able to discuss with you more where this goes, is to say there's nothing it's like to be a bat. There is only something it's like to be the bat's representation of a bat, or the bat's representation of what it's like flying through the world. And why is this a good idea? To my mind, because if you ask what is it like to be a bat's representation of itself now, the answer is it's like whatever the representation says it's like, because that's what representations are. So that's my way of avoiding. I haven't solved the hard problem. I've simply said we never should have got into the hard problem in the first place. So I would love your response to that, because I think it leads to a very different way of doing consciousness studies, of the experiments that we should do and so on. And I'm interested in working out where this goes. And I'd love your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Just for the sake of the audience, we have this running discussion already in the background for a while. So I'll say things that you already know, because we have had this discussion, but for the sake of the audience, I will repeat. Because you are not a materialist, by doing this, you get rid of the hard problem. I agree with you. I don't think doing this saves the materialist from the hard problem. No. I am with you. I know that you believe that mind tends to deceive itself. You know that I agree with you. I am known for saying that the mind's first directive is to deceive itself. So I go even further than you. I think it's really a fundamental property of mind that it seeks actively to deceive itself. It's not even something that is casual or circumstantial or it's dispositional, it's archetypal. So I can't defend that, but that's what I believe. Huh?
Not just an accident or byproduct. It's central.
Yeah, I think it's central. It's part of the inherent properties of mind, this attempt to deceive itself. It's what creates the world, in a sense. Creates the personal self, which is it's a delusion right there, right? There is no reason for us to think that there is such a thing as a true personal agent that remains the same across time, that it is just not there. And the more you look, the more you don't find it. Now, I am completely comfortable with the idea that what is it like to be a bat is what it is like to be the model of the bat, and that there is nothing it is like to fundamentally be a bat, because the bat isn't even there. The person isn't even there. What are we talking about? What is it like to be something that doesn't exist? It's always what is it like to be a model. Yes. And that model is a conscious model. It's a mental model. I'm totally comfortable with that. The reason I think this doesn't save the materialist is that if you are a materialist or an illusionist or an eliminativist, the argument line that started with Dennett in 91 goes like this. There's only neuroactivity. That's all there is. Why doesn't it feel to us like we are neuroactivity? Why does our sense of being, our model of ourselves, feel so different than neurons firing? Well, it's because what we experience is a model of ourselves, and that model is a kind of digest of what is really going on. And that digest feels different than neuroactivity. That's then its attempt as a materialist to get rid of the hard problem. I think it doesn't work because premise one is there is only neuroactivity, so that model of the self can only be neuroactivity. So you only postpone the problem, because why doesn't the model of the self then feels like neuroactivity? Well, we need a meta model, but that meta model can only be made of neuroactivity because that's your first premise. That's all there is. So why doesn't the meta model feel like neuroactivity? So you can keep on playing that meta problem forever, postponing the problem like Keith Frankish does, but it just postpones it. It doesn't solve anything. In your case, it helps because you are not a materialist. You are more. You had a word the other day by email that I thought was a great word. Your basic premise is that the mind is always deceiving itself, so it creates models of itself.
Delusionist.
I'm completely but you are not an eliminativist illusionist.
No,
You're a delusionist. Something like that. I'm comfortable with that. I think what it is like to be Bernardo is a delusion. There is no Bernardo. There is a fluid, moving pattern of mental states that has changed a gazillion times since the day I was born. There is no such a thing as Bernardo, so there cannot be anything it is like to be a Bernardo that doesn't exist. There can only be a model of Bernardo, and that model remains more or less stable. It's a narrative, I tell myself. I'm totally comfortable with that because it's entirely compatible with idealism. In idealism, there are only mental states. Those mental states can come together in the form of a self-delusive model. What is important is that idealism maintains the space for the delusion to exist. Even if everything's an illusion, everything's a delusion, we still experience the illusions and the delusions. And idealism makes room available for that, which it doesn't for the eliminativist or the illusionist in the materialist sense. Because if you say consciousness is an illusion, well, it backfires immediately because the illusion is experienced. So there has to be a consciousness to experience the illusion of consciousness. If everything is an illusion, then precisely what we are saying is that there is only consciousness. And there is nothing outside consciousness that factually corresponds to the inner statements of consciousness.
Okay, I'm not sure I'd take the last step with you, but I want to go back a little bit to ask you about all the other models going on. So whatever we think about this brain here, that it's observed by somebody else and is ultimately mental and so on, we know there's a huge amount of processing going on, that actually a rather small amount of it contributes to the self-model, the phenomenal self-model, if you like. There's masses and masses of other stuff going on. Now, would you say there is some, would you agree with me that there is something it is like to be all of those models? I mean, I want to take, you could perhaps call it a panpsychism of representations, if you like. I mean, I'm not a panpsychist in the traditional sense of, atoms can be conscious and so on. But I'm thinking that it doesn't make sense to make the sense of self, which comes and goes and is ephemeral and keeps changing, the only thing that there is something it's like to be. I would say that all of the models going on in here or in a rat's or bat's brain, there's something it's like to be them. So if you take, let's say, low down in the predictive hierarchy in, let's say, visual cortex, the models are so simple as to be completely uninteresting and very fleeting, but although they're important to feed into information into higher levels, they're just, it's a line in this direction, not this direction, or a bit higher up in temporal lobe there, this is some kind of a face, and it's not a house, or whatever there might be. I would say there's something it's like to be them. Otherwise, I'm being inconsistent about there's something it's like to be me, and so on all the way up the system. And as you know, I'm very interested in what happens when you through meditation or psychedelics or in some other way dissolve or completely transform the self-model. Because if that then goes away to the sense that I'm not there, there's all this left. There's this stuff which doesn't hang together and pulled together by an idea there's me in the middle. Nevertheless, it's still going on. I can see you nodding. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, here I have to be cautious because you have 40 years of experience in meditation and I have 0. So I'm on eggshells here because I can't compare my own experience with yours. So I may come across as a bit of a fool. So forgive me in advance, Sue. The only experience I have had that is comparable to what you described now and what you have described before is a psychedelic trip in which I underwent ego dissolution. And yes, there was no Bernardo. There was no personal agent. There was no perceiver separate from the perceived. All of that had disappeared. And yet there was something, otherwise I wouldn't be talking about it, right? I wouldn't be pointing my finger to that, which I can't describe. So yeah, I relate to that. But let me go back to my comfort zone now, which is thought. And as you know, over the past several years, I've been becoming more and more fond of integrated information theory. And IIT has a very nice account that supports what you said. IIT would say that a complex will form to maximize information integration. But if you run the models, especially with IIT4, which is fairly sophisticated now, if you run the models, you will see that complex will grow, and then it will stop growing, and it will shed off parts of itself. It will form what they call fault lines, technically, in IIT. And what it means is that sometimes you integrate more information by shedding off certain states. You get more integrated information. And what we experience as the ego, that model of the self, I think it's one of these maximal phi complexes in IIT. And it will grow, but it will grow only to a certain point, and then it will start shedding things off in order to maximize information integration. That which is shed off still has a subjective point of view of its own. It's still made of mental processes. It's still other complexes. They are complexes in the IIT framework. They are just not sort of co-opted or pulled into the maximal complex, which runs the models of the personal self. So from that perspective, which I agree with, what you said is perfectly coherent, even inevitable. There has to be something. It is like to be these other complexes that are not integrated into the self model, the narrative self. They have to be there. There is no way to get around it.
That's very interesting. And here I admit to my ignorance or inability to understand the complexities of IIT, which, as you admit, is very, very difficult, and you're better able to understand it than I am. What I have failed to understand really in that is why there is anything it is like to be. So when IIT talks about the more integrated information, then the more consciousness there is, and that's what phi is measuring. I'm not sure what it really means that consciousness is, that there's more or less of. Can you clarify that for me? I mean, I've read Christoph Koch's latest book, which is great and helped, but it's very much for the ordinary person, which I consider myself to be in this when facing it.
It will not answer your questions.
No.
But by the way, I love his latest book. I really delighted in reading it. Christoph has an ability to convey complicated things in a way that is romantic and engaging and inspiring. I envy that.
We were both in Tucson together, and he gave me one of the first copies of his book, and we had a discussion about it then. So it was great. So I had some affectionate feelings about the book as well as then really,
and the title,
enjoying it.
The title comes from one of those booklets that accompany the Wagner's operas. So one of the operas, is it? No, it's not Parsifal. I forgot which one. It's one of the Ring.
It's Tristan and Isolde.
Tristan and Isolde, and it says, and then I am myself the world, and that's the title. I loved that. I'll speak in two levels. The first one is easy to understand, but it's not entirely true. So bear with me. What is not entirely true, but is true enough, is that IIT is a map between the states of the substrate, measurable brain activity, and the subjective states, what the felt experience. What IIT tries to do is to build a map between these two domains, such that if you have only one, you can infer the other. So if you are dealing with conscious subjects and you're basing yourself in subjective reports, then you have both sides of the map. You have the measurable brain states and you have reported experience. And you can use that to build this transfer function that links the two. And then if you build it correctly, then you can infer the other side if you have only one, like people with locked-in syndrome or people in a coma. Are they conscious or are they really vegetative? So IIT can allow you to infer one of the sides when it's missing. So at this first level, IIT is not busying itself with what is consciousness. It's an operational scientific theory that makes measurable predictions. And that's it. It's not a philosophy. It's not a metaphysics. It's an operational scientific theory that makes predictions. So in that sense, it's really, really, pure science. Now, of course, the people doing this are smart people, and they have been doing this for over 20 years, and they have refined their thoughts about it. And Giulio has come to the conclusion that there are certain modest ontological implications of IIT. In other words, it doesn't imply a whole metaphysics, but there are some minor ontological implications. And he elaborated on this in a paper published in the archive. It's not peer-reviewed because it's not the kind of thing that, the journals would publish. It's more of a, science/philosophy paper. And it has free will in the title, although what he means by free will is not libertarian free will, it's something else. But he elaborates on the ontological implications of IIT. And the key point there is that he says, the substrate, measured brain activity, has an explanatory identity with experience. In other words, you can derive one from the other. He's going out of his way not to say that the substrate generates experience.
Yeah.
He's saying that there is an explanatory identity between the two. So it's really clean metaphysics he's trying to do that. He's very careful with what he says. And what he doesn't say is as important as what he does say. And then he takes one small step further, but which has some idealistic implications, which, in my view, which is to say, when he starts talking about causality, what is it that has the power to cause? Under IIT, only a complex can cause. And it may be a minimum complex. He calls it ontological dust, which is like an extremely simple experiential complex, like a binary experiential state. It's light or dark, something like this, very simple. But only that can cause. And if only that can cause, then what can cause exists for itself. Because in IIT, there is a difference between what exists only representationally. So if I am a subject and I am dreaming of a green elephant, then that elephant exists for me. It doesn't exist for itself. It exists only so far as the images that I made up in my own dreaming mind. But what exists not for itself cannot cause. The green elephant causes nothing. I cause it. It itself causes nothing. It's a product of causation. But what causes it is my dreaming complex, my hi-fi dreaming complex. So he makes that distinction and he proceeds to say only what exists for itself can cause. And lo and behold, only what experiences exist for itself. The green elephant doesn't experience. It is experienced. It exists for my complex, but it is not a complex in and of itself because it's fully integrated in my hi-fi complex. That's the principle of exclusion in IIT. So this has idealistic implications. If IIT has any ontological implications, and I would prefer to say it doesn't, you can do IIT under materialism because it's a bridge. It's mapping two domains and makes measurable predictions. But insofar as you dig really deep and you realize that there is a minimum phi complex, there is ontological dust, and that the entire causal structure of a complex in IIT depends on things existing for themselves, then you could say, well, this leans idealism, but I wouldn't say it implies idealism.
Can I pick you up on the green elephant? Because thank you for that. it's very helpful because I've been wondering about this notion of causality in IIT. And so the green elephant is relevant here because you blithely introduced I. So the elephant is cannot cause things of itself because you caused it. Now, what is the you there? Because we've already agreed that there are problems with what we mean by a self, that selves are not what they seem to be, and so on. So can you explain in this theory what you meant by I caused the elephant, I have causal powers, and the green elephant in the dream doesn't?
Yeah, under IIT, it would be the complex wherein the elephant exists. So it's a complex of information integration. Part of that information that is integrated corresponds to what we describe as the elephant. But again, IIT is a scientific theory. It's not a metaphysics. So to give a satisfying answer to your question, now I will be talking philosophy. So I'm not talking IIT now. Now it's my own philosophical interpretation of IIT and idealism and all that. There is a paper written by philosopher Itay Shani back in 2014. On Artakenis, if I remember, he talks about his definition of core subjectivity. And what he tried to do there was to create a linguistic, at least a conceptual distinction between subjectivity and its contents. Now, I am with you. There are no such things as contents of subjectivity separate from subjectivity. I see the contents of subjectivity as excitations of subjectivity, just like ripples are excitations of the lake. Ripples are not a thing. You cannot fish out a ripple, put it under your arm and walk home with the ripple. There is no ripple. There's only the lake doing something. So I think experiences are subjectivity doing something. They are not contents of subjectivity. They are behaviors of subjectivity. But he tried to make this linguistic and conceptual distinction between particular excitations or particular experiences and the thing to which those experiences are given. In other words, he's looking for the dative of experience. That which experiences the experiences, the dancer behind the dance, the top behind the spin, the river behind the ripple. And he calls it core subjectivity. And you can imagine it as the guitar string that when plucked can play many musical notes, but which exists even when it's not vibrating, when it's not excited, when it's not producing musical notes, when it's not experiencing. It's the underlying ontological agent, so to say, and he calls it core subjectivity. I think what really exists in nature is one universal core subjectivity, and we are it. When there is ego dissolution and the personal self dissolves, we sort of fall back into core subjectivity with some excitations because we report something, right? There was something there that was experienced, and but it's closer to that core subjectivity, that one thing that really exists, and everything else are just patterns of excitation, vibrations, if you will, metaphorically, of that core subjectivity, which dovetails nicely, if speculatively, with the notion of a unified field in physics, which we don't have. We don't have a unified field theory, but that's where everybody's trying to get. 17 quantum fields plus gravity, that won't do, right? It has got to be simpler than that. Reductionism has worked for 500 years. It cannot stop working now. We should be able to make a few more steps. And if it gets to one thing that you identify with Itay Shani's core subjectivity, that's the underlying reality, and everything else are its modes of excitation. That's my view.
Well, is this fundamentally different, his view from yours? Oh, sorry, Jake, you wanted to interject there.
No, please continue. Yeah.
You mean Itay Shani's view?
Yeah. Are you just saying
no,
that this is not the same kind of idealism you're talking about?
No, he will call himself a cosmopsychist. At least he did. I haven't spoken to him in a couple of years since the quarantine. I lost contact with him. But he used to be a cosmopsychist, which is a modern name for idealism. He was a cosmopsychist. Maybe he still is. So his views align with mine.
I'm still puzzled about this green elephant because maybe this is unimportant, but I'm trying to understand where IIT can really help us with this. Now, you happened to use an example of dreaming of the green elephant, not sitting here awake and going, as I can do now, there's a green elephant standing on top of my computer screen. So again, there's a problem with the self there, because in an ordinary, not lucid dream, there's not really me. You can easily have a dream that you remember when you wake up that there was a green elephant and it was trumpeting and walking along or whatever it was doing. And so what are the causal things here, and how would IIT help, or how would your idealism help here to understand about the way the green elephant is different from the rest of the dream? Where are the causal factors coming here? The green elephant, you have said, cannot cause anything itself. It was caused by you, but in an ordinary dream, there's not a firm sense of self there, not unless you become lucid. So I'm still wondering, where is this causality coming from in this example, and by implication, all sorts of other examples?
In analytic idealism, there is only one thing, that's this core subjectivity. You can imagine it as a field. You sort of presuppose space-time, and physics is bringing us to a place where even space-time is not fundamental. So we have to be careful with field analogies. But for the purposes of this discussion, you can imagine it as a field, like a quantum field, spatially unbound. And it's a field of subjectivity. And because it exists, it has properties, right? Philosophically, to be is to have properties. You are what you are instead of something you could conceivably be. So to be is to have properties. And if it's a field of subjectivity, it's fair to talk about these properties in terms of archetypes, because that's the word for mental properties, or intrinsic mental properties is the word that psychology has for it, archetype, at least analytic psychology. So this core subjectivity field has inherent properties. It is what it is instead of something else it could be. And those properties are archetypal. That's what governs all causality. One of its properties is the disposition to self-excitation, because things are happening, right? The universe is dynamic. So whatever the universe is, it's self-excited. Otherwise, nothing would be happening. And there's nothing to excite it from the outside, because it's the sum total of nature. It's all that exists. So the excitation has to be internal. So one of the archetypes is this propensity, irresistible propensity to self-excitation. Other archetypes govern the form of these excitations. You can think of it in a very naturalistic way. Think of a drum head, that animal skin that is stretched over a drum. When you hit it and you excite it, it will vibrate according to certain harmonics, certain modes, and not others. If you spread salt on it, you can even see the shape of those harmonics. They are very complex. There are many modes. And what gives those modes? Well, it's the properties of that animal skin. How far is it stretched? What is its elasticity? What is its geometry? What is its size? All of that will determine its natural modes of excitation. So core subjectivity has natural modes of excitations because it exists, it has properties, and those properties define those modes. That's the root of all causality. It's those fundamental intrinsic properties of the one thing that exists. It's archetypal properties, if you will. It's natural modes of excitation. It's natural frequencies. It's harmonics. And because it self-interferes, like ripples can impinge upon one another and interfere constructively and destructively. So you get a whole circus of complexity out of simple rules, like in a cellular automaton, like in the game of life. A very simple rule: if you have 2 or 3 neighbors alive, you are born or you stay alive, otherwise you die or you stay dead. And a whole universe emerges out of that. And complexity science is telling us that all the richness of nature can arise from very simple properties. And if you see the root of nature as this field of subjectivity with archetypal properties, natural modes of excitation, everything else you can build from there. For a committed reductionist like me, this is music. I love it. It's incredibly parsimonious.
You hinted at something really critical there, and perhaps this can be the last thing, because I think I said, Jake, because of my chronic fatigue, I always say I can't do this for more than an hour, however wonderful it is, and I'd like to carry on. So I hope we'll be able to stop quite soon. But you hinted here at the question of time and space, whether they're fundamental. And as a reductionist, I guess this is very much a question in your mind. I'm interested in this from the point of view, and I'm going back to the meditation and psychedelic experiences here. I'm quite familiar, or this thing here, or what should be the subject in this, is quite familiar with getting into states in which time disintegrates and space doesn't seem to have the same meaning anymore. Now, what's odd about it, and I'm sure there's plenty further to go with this, and it's one of the things that tempts me to keep meditating every day, as I have for 40 years or whatever it is, because it's so fascinating. But one of the things that happens with dramatic letting go of whatever's happening is there's a state in which there seems to be things happening. It's not that there's nothing. There's something happening. I'm talking about Zen meditation, eye-open meditation. So your eyes are still functioning, your ears are still functioning. There's something happening, but it's no longer happening in time or space. That's as well as I can remember what it's like. And of course, that's a problem in itself, but it does lean me towards wondering deeply about whether time and space are fundamental, and that all of our conversation here about how brains work and vibrations and everything, kind of, we talk about it with the implication of time and space. So I'd love your thoughts on that tricky one before I have to give up thinking because my brain hurts.
Is long COVID that you have, Sue?
Sorry? I didn't hear that.
Is it long COVID that you have?
Exacerbated by long COVID. Back in 1995 to 6, I had a year of chronic fatigue caused by a virus. It was post-viral fatigue. And I was in bed for months and months, and finally got better and went back to work after a year. And then I was okay. I had to be careful and sleep a lot, but I was fine until 2018 when I did another stupid round the world lecturing tour, completely crashed when I got back, was ill for quite a long time, then was recovering from that. Then I got COVID last October, and that was about 5 months, and it felt just the same. So I don't know that I can distinguish long COVID from other forms of chronic fatigue, but now I'm trying to be really careful because I can so easily crash.
Yeah. I know someone who has myalgic encephalopathy, ME.
Yeah.
And then COVID on top of it, and it was devastating. It just floored him.
I am hoping
so we'll
to
make
avoid
this,
that.
Bernardo, the last. Yeah. So Bernardo, we'll make this the last remark, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay. So I'll try to be. It's just about the most difficult subject.
That's great. We'll end on a really difficult thing and leave it in the air. Yeah, go on.
In philosophy in the West, the first people to have to confront this were Kant and Schopenhauer, because they said space-time are categories of perception. They are not objective dimensions of the world out there. The world out there has no time and space. Only our representations of the world have. So time and space are in us, not in the world. And of course, the difficulty it posed immediately is that it's what Schopenhauer called the principium individuationis. If you don't have space-time extension, then everything collapses on top of each other, and there is only unity. You don't have structure anymore. Because to have structure, you have to have differentiation, and to have differentiation, you have to have extension. So if you have no extension, you don't have differentiation and no structure. And the way we have gotten along with this for the last 200 years is to deny this, is to deny that space-time are in here and not out there. And we got to the point where we acknowledge that one of them may not exist. So Julian Barbour wrote in 1999 a book called The End of Time, in which he said, you can write all of physics without time. And then a couple of years later, we got Lee Smolin wrote a book saying, you can rewrite everything without space. Only time exists. And now we get to the point where we are saying, well, neither is there. But obviously, nature has structure, right? Our experience has structure. Nature has structure. How can there be structure without extension? And I'm biased here, but I think idealism is what offers an opportunity here to solve the problem. Without idealism, we have to talk about mathematical structure, pure abstraction, ungrounded in anything real, ontologically real. But under idealism, you can say there is cognitive structure, even in the absence of spatial temporal extension. For instance, if you are my friend, this is a cognitive association that has meaning. Our friendship is meaning. And that meaning exists independently of extension. If all time were to collapse into the now, friendship still has meaning. Semantic content has structure that does not depend on extension. So I think under idealism, all the structure of nature is semantic structure. It's structure of meaning. And it does not require spatial temporal extension to exist. I suspect that that's where we sort of land when we I don't have that experience myself of transcending space-time, so I'm sort of, talking out of my ears here, but I can conceptualize that when we come back from an experience of being outside space-time and still having something to say, what we are pointing to is cognitive structure. I suspect.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I haven't been there, Sue. I haven't been there.
And a lot of this is just letting go of all those cognitive structures. A wonderful place to end up. Thank you very much. It's great to talk to you in person, Bernardo.
It was a pleasure.